When David stood at that podium accepting the Corporate Excellence Award and called me his devoted wife who stands by him through every challenge, I smiled sweetly from the audience before standing up to announce, "Speaking of challenges, David, would you like to tell everyone about your 3-year-old daughter Emma? Or should I?" The color drained from his face as 500 industry leaders turned to stare, and I knew my revenge for calling me broken after our miscarriage was complete. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The crystal tears were still wet on my cheeks as I sat in the sterile hospital bed, my body aching from what the doctors clinically called a spontaneous abortion at 14 weeks. But to me, it was the death of our baby girl, the daughter David and I had already named Isabella, whose nursery was half-painted in soft lavender, whose tiny clothes were already folded in pristine drawers. The silence in the private room at Cedar Valley Medical Center was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of monitors that seemed to mock the absence of the heartbeat we'd heard just a week ago. David sat in the chair beside my bed, scrolling through his phone with the same detached expression he wore during quarterly board meetings. His navy suit was still perfectly pressed, his silver watch catching the harsh fluorescent light as he typed what appeared to be urgent email. This was supposed to be the day we announced our pregnancy to his parents, the day we'd planned to share our joy with the world. Instead, I was mourning alone while my husband of 6 years treated this like a minor inconvenience in his busy schedule. "The doctor said we can try again in a few months," David said without looking up from his phone, his voice carrying the same tone he used to discuss market projections. "These things happen, Victoria. It's probably for the best anyway, considering how demanding my promotion schedule is going to be." I stared at him in disbelief, my heart breaking all over again. For the best? Our baby daughter, the child we'd seen moving on the ultrasound screen just days ago, was for the best to lose. I'd been carrying our miracle for 14 weeks, had felt the first flutter of movement, had watched David trace letters on my belly while whispering promises to our unborn daughter. Now he was discussing her death like a canceled vacation. "David," I whispered, my voice hoarse from crying. "We lost our baby, our daughter. Don't you feel anything?" He finally looked up from his phone, his steel gray eyes holding none of the warmth I'd fallen in love with during our college years at Northwestern. "Of course I feel something, Victoria, but dwelling on what we can't change isn't productive. We need to focus on moving forward, not staying stuck in grief that won't bring the pregnancy back." The clinical way he referred to Isabella as the pregnancy felt like a slap across my already raw heart. This was the same man who had cried when we'd first heard her heartbeat, who had spent hours researching the best schools in Chicago before we'd even entered the second trimester. The same man who had promised to love and protect our family no matter what challenges we faced. "I need some time to process this," I said, pulling the hospital blanket closer around my shoulders. "Can you please just sit with me? Can we grieve together?" David glanced at his watch, a gesture that had become increasingly familiar over the past year, as his career at Morrison Financial Group had consumed more of his attention. "I have a client dinner at 7 that I can't reschedule. The Patterson account is worth $12 million, Victoria. I can't afford to appear unreliable right now, especially with the promotion announcement coming next month." I felt something inside me break that had nothing to do with the physical trauma I'd just endured. "Your wife just lost your baby, and you're worried about a client dinner." "Don't be dramatic," David replied, already standing and straightening his tie. "The doctor said you're physically fine. You'll be discharged tomorrow morning, and we can put this behind us. Maybe this happened because you weren't ready to be a mother yet. Your career at the museum has been demanding lately, and stress can affect pregnancy outcomes." The accusation hit me like a physical blow. I was 32 years old, had been promoted to senior curator at the Chicago Contemporary Art Museum just 6 months ago, and had been nothing but careful during my pregnancy. I'd given up wine, coffee, soft cheeses, and everything else on the endless list of pregnancy restrictions. I'd left work early for every appointment, had turned down travel opportunities, had done everything possible to protect our baby. "You're blaming me?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the sudden ringing in my ears. "I'm not blaming anyone," David said, but his tone suggested otherwise. I'm just saying that maybe your body wasn't ready for pregnancy yet. Maybe this is nature's way of telling us to wait until we're both more established in our career. He gathered his briefcase and coat, preparing to leave me alone in this hospital room that still smelled like antiseptic and shattered dreams. I'll pick you up tomorrow morning. Try to get some rest and please don't dwell on this any more than necessary. You'll make yourself sick with grief if you're not careful. With that, he was gone, leaving me alone with my devastation, and the crushing realization that the man I'd married was capable of abandoning me in my darkest hour. The silence that followed his departure was different from the peaceful quiet we used to share during lazy Sunday mornings in our Lincoln Park townhouse. This was the silence of abandonment, of a marriage that had just revealed its true nature when tested by genuine crisis. I'd met David during my senior year at Northwestern University, where I was completing my master's degree in art history, while he finished his MBA at Kellogg. It was October 2016, and I was 25 years old with dreams of revolutionizing how people experienced contemporary art. David was 27, devastatingly handsome with his dark hair and those piercing gray eyes, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his ability to succeed. Our first encounter was at a campus coffee shop, where I was frantically reviewing notes for my thesis defense on feminist art movements of the 1990s. David was at the next table, surrounded by financial textbooks and laptop screens displaying complex market analysis charts. When my coffee cup tipped over, sending a wave of caramel macchiato across my carefully organized research notes, I thought my academic career might be over. "Here, let me help," David had said, immediately offering his napkins and helping me salvage what we could of my water-damaged paper. "Looks like important work. Art history, contemporary feminist art analysis," I'd replied, grateful for his quick response but devastated by the loss of weeks of research. "I'm defending my thesis next week, and these were my only printed copies of some rare exhibition review." David studied the partially legible text with genuine interest. Mary Cassatt, Georgia O'Keeffe. I was surprised by his recognition of the artist. "Actually, I'm focusing on lesser-known artists from the 1990s who challenged traditional gender representations in gallery spaces. Artists like Kara Walker and Cindy Sherman." "That sounds fascinating," David had said, and something in his tone suggested he actually meant it rather than just being polite. "I'm David Morrison, by the way, MBA student, but I've always been interested in how art markets reflect cultural value." "Victoria Chen," I'd replied, studying his face for signs of condescension that never appeared. "Most business students think art history is impractical. Most business students don't understand that cultural movements drive economic trends," David had countered with a smile that made my stomach flutter unexpectedly. "The artists you're studying were probably ahead of their time in ways that businesses are just starting to catch up to." That conversation led to coffee the next day, then dinner, then long walks along Lake Michigan where David would ask thoughtful questions about my research, while sharing his own ambitions to revolutionize corporate finance through ethical investing practices. Unlike other men I'd dated who seemed intimidated by my academic pursuits, David encouraged my passion for art, and even attended my thesis defense, sitting in the back row and giving me encouraging smiles throughout my presentation. "You were brilliant up there," he'd said afterward, pulling me into a hug that felt like coming home. "The way you connected those artistic movements to broader social changes was incredible. You're going to change how people think about art." Our relationship developed naturally over the following months. David would bring me coffee during late-night study sessions, while I helped him understand the cultural context behind the companies he was analyzing for investment potential. We discovered shared values about making meaningful contributions to society, even if we were approaching that goal from different angles. "I want to build something that lasts," David had told me one evening, as we walked through the Art Institute of Chicago, where I'd taken him to see an exhibition I'd helped curate as part of my graduate program. "Not just wealth, but a legacy. Something that makes the world better." I'd been impressed by his vision, the way he talked about using business success as a platform for philanthropy and social impact. David wasn't just ambitious, He was idealistic in ways that complemented my own dreams of democratizing art access and education. By spring 2017, we were inseparable. David had been accepted into a prestigious analyst program at Goldman Sachs in Chicago. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. While I'd received an offer from the Contemporary Art Museum as an associate curator, our careers were launching simultaneously, and everything felt perfectly aligned. "We're going to be unstoppable," David had said one evening, as we celebrated both of our job offers at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the Chicago skyline. "You'll revolutionize how people experience art, and I'll prove that ethical business practices are more profitable than traditional approaches." The proposal came in December 2017, during a snowstorm that had blanketed Grant Park in pristine. We'd been walking through the park where David used to meet me after my museum shifts, and he'd stopped in front of the Crown Fountain, where we'd shared our first kiss months earlier. "Victoria Chen," he'd said, dropping to one knee despite the snow swirling around us, "you've made me believe that success means nothing without someone extraordinary to share it with. Will you marry me and make all of our dreams come true together?" The ring was perfect, a vintage Art Deco setting that reflected my love of historical design. But what made the moment perfect wasn't the ring or the romantic setting, it was the certainty in David's eyes, and the way he'd chosen a location that held meaning for our relationship rather than just looking impressive. Our wedding in June 2018 was everything we'd dreamed of, elegant but not ostentatious. Held at the Chicago Botanic Garden with 200 of our closest friends and family members. David had insisted on writing his own vows, and I still remembered how his voice had broken slightly when he'd promised to build a life with you that's more beautiful than any art we could ever collect or display. For the first 4 years of our marriage, that promise had held true. We'd bought our townhouse in Lincoln Park, a restored 1920s building with enough space for David's home office, and a room I'd converted into a private gallery for pieces I was considering for museum acquisition. David's career at Morrison Financial Group flourished as he developed innovative investment strategies that attracted high-profile clients, while I was promoted through the ranks at the museum, eventually overseeing major exhibitions that gained national attention. We traveled together to art fairs in Miami and Ball attended gallery openings where David would charm donors while I explained the cultural significance of contemporary installation. Our life felt like a perfect balance of professional success and personal fulfillment, each of us supporting the other's ambitions while building something meaningful together. "You're my secret weapon," David would tell museum board members at fundraising galas, his arm around my waist, as we moved through crowds of Chicago's cultural elite. "Victoria doesn't just understand art, she understands how art can transform communities and create lasting value." It wasn't flattery. I'd developed specialized expertise in community engagement programs that brought contemporary art to underserved neighborhoods, initiatives that attracted both media attention and major donations to the museum. When the museum launched its innovative mobile gallery program in 2021, David had insisted on attending the press conference to support my achievement. "This success belongs to both of us," he'd said afterward, pulling me close as we read the positive reviews in the Chicago Tribune. "Your vision for accessible art education is changing this city, and I'm so proud to be your husband." We'd started discussing children seriously around our 3rd anniversary, not in the vague someday way of our dating years, but with concrete timelines and practical consideration. David wanted kids who would grow up surrounded by art and culture, who would understand the importance of both creativity and financial responsibility. "I want our children to have Sunday morning pancakes and museum adventures," David would say, standing in what we designated as the future nursery. "I want them to learn that success means contributing something meaningful to the world, not just accumulating wealth." By early 2022, we'd decided the timing was right. David's position at Morrison Financial was secure enough to provide stability, and my role at the museum had evolved to include more strategic planning and less travel. We began trying to conceive with the same careful planning we applied to everything else in our lives. The positive pregnancy test came in March 2022, And David's reaction was everything I'd hoped for. He'd cried when I showed him the 2 pink lines, then immediately started calculating due dates and planning how we'd balance career responsibilities with parenthood. "Our daughter is going to be incredible," he'd whispered that night, his hand resting on my still flat stomach. "She's going to have your creativity and intelligence, and hopefully my business sense." "How do you know it's a daughter?" I'd asked, smiling at his certainty. "I just know," David had replied. "Isabella Chen Morrison is going to change the world." Those first few months of pregnancy had been magical. David would talk to my growing belly every morning before work, sharing his plans for our daughter's future, while I prepared for meetings with museum donors. He'd researched the best pediatricians in Chicago, had started sketching ideas for converting the spare room into a nursery, and had even begun learning Mandarin so he could teach Isabella my grandmother's language. The 14-week ultrasound had been our last moment of pure happiness. We'd seen Isabella moving, watched her tiny heart beating steadily on the grainy monitor, and heard the technician confirm that everything looked perfectly normal. David had recorded the heartbeat on his phone, and played it every evening while we planned nursery colors and discussed parenting philosophies. "She's already beautiful," David had said, studying the ultrasound photos with wonder. "Look at her perfect little profile. She's going to be an artist like her mother." 3 days later, the cramping started, then the bleeding, then the frantic drive to Cedar Valley Medical Center, where doctors delivered the news that would shatter both our hearts and reveal the true character of the man I'd married. The week following the miscarriage passed in a haze of grief and growing disillusionment with my marriage. David returned to work immediately, claiming that staying busy would help him process our loss, while I took bereavement leave from the museum and spent my days wandering through our townhouse like a ghost haunting her own life. Every room held reminders of the future we'd been planning, from the half-painted nursery to the pregnancy books stacked on David's nightstand. The isolation was devastating. My friends from the museum called regularly, offering support and understanding, but David seemed to have erected an emotional wall between us that grew higher each day. He worked late, claimed urgent client meetings required weekend travel, and when he was home he treated our loss like a minor setback rather than the profound trauma it was. "You need to move on, Victoria," he said one evening when he found me crying over a maternity dress I'd bought just weeks earlier. "Dwelling on this isn't healthy. We have so much to be grateful for. Our careers, our house, our future opportunities. One miscarriage doesn't define our life." The casual way he dismissed our daughter's death as one miscarriage felt like a betrayal almost as profound as the loss itself. This wasn't a statistical setback to me. It was the death of our child, the end of dreams we'd shared, the shattering of the family we'd been so close to begin. "I need time to grieve," I'd replied, my voice hollow with exhaustion. "I need my husband to grieve with me." "I've processed it," David had said, already reaching for his laptop to review client portfolios. "Getting stuck in sadness won't bring the baby back. We need to focus on the future, not torture ourselves about something we couldn't control." But the future felt impossible to imagine without acknowledging the loss that had brought us to this point. David's determination to move forward without processing our grief felt like another form of abandonment, as if he was forcing me to choose between mourning our daughter and maintaining my marriage. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Thursday evening in early December, exactly 1 month after we'd lost Isabel. David came home from work carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing an expression I hadn't seen since before the miscarriage, genuine excitement mixed with professional triumph. "We need to celebrate," he announced, setting the bottle on our kitchen counter with ceremony. "Morrison Financial just offered me the senior vice president position. It's everything I've worked toward, Victoria. This promotion will set us up for life." I stared at the champagne, remembering how we'd celebrated my own promotion just over a year ago, how David had insisted that our professional successes belonged to both of us. Now he was celebrating alone while I was still struggling to get through each day without falling apart. "That's wonderful," I managed, my voice flat with exhaustion. "I'm proud of you." David's expression shifted to something between disappointment and irritation. "You don't sound proud. You sound like you're reading from a script." "I'm sorry," I said, suddenly feeling guilty for not matching his enthusiasm. "I'm still having trouble feeling excited about anything right now. It's hard to celebrate when I'm still mourning our daughter." "Our daughter?" David's voice took on an edge. I'd never heard before. Victoria, we lost a pregnancy, a 14-week pregnancy. It wasn't even a viable child yet. The clinical terminology hit me like a physical blow. She was our daughter, David. We named her Isabella. You talked to her every morning. You were planning her future. I was being optimistic about a pregnancy that had a 30% chance of miscarriage at that stage, David replied, his tone shifting to the same condescending voice he used with difficult clients. I've done the research, Victoria. First pregnancies fail at high rate. It's biology, not tragedy. I stared at my husband, searching his face for any trace of the man who had cried when we'd first heard Isabella's heartbeat. Instead, I saw someone who seemed almost angry at me for refusing to move past our loss as quickly as he had. So you feel nothing? I asked. No sadness, no sense of loss, no grief for the future we were planning. David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I recognized as his response to stress. Of course I feel something, but I feel more frustrated that you're letting this control your life. You've been moping around this house for a month, Victoria. You're barely eating, you're not working, you're not functioning. It's not healthy. I'm grieving, I said, my voice rising with desperation. I'm processing the loss of our child. That's normal, Dave. That's what people do when they experience trauma. What's not normal is using grief as an excuse to shut down completely. David shot back. You're wallowing, Victoria. You're choosing to stay broken instead of healing and moving forward. The word broken hung in the air between us like a blade. David had just called me broken for grieving our daughter's death, for needing time to process the most devastating experience of my life. The man who had promised to love and support me through every challenge was now treating my grief like a character flaw. Broken, I repeated, my voice barely audible. David's expression suggested he immediately regretted his word choice, but instead of apologizing, he doubled down. I mean, psychologically stuck. You're choosing to remain in this depressed state instead of accepting what happened and rebuilding. It's been a month, Victoria. Normal people don't stay devastated this long over a miscarriage. Each word felt like another nail in the coffin of our marriage. Normal people, as if there was a prescribed timeline for grief, as if mourning our daughter made me abnormal or defective. Get out, I said quietly. What? Get out of this house, I repeated, my voice gaining strength. If I'm so broken and abnormal for grieving our daughter, then you shouldn't have to live with someone so psychologically damaged. David stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his eye. Not regret or remorse, but calculation, as if he was weighing whether to fight for our marriage, or accept this as an opportunity to escape. Maybe you're right, he said finally. Maybe we both need some space to figure out what we really want. The ease with which he agreed to leave told me everything I needed to know about the state of our marriage. David didn't want to fight for us, didn't want to support me through the hardest period of my life, didn't even want to grieve our daughter together. He wanted out, and I'd just given him permission to go. He packed a bag that night, gathering clothes and toiletries with the same efficiency he brought to business presentation. There was no discussion of counseling, no attempt to repair what had been broken between us, no acknowledgement that we were ending 6 years of marriage over his inability to support me through loss. I'll be staying at the Palmer House downtown, he said as he gathered his laptop and briefcase. We can talk when you're feeling more rational, as if grief was irrational, as if mourning our daughter was a temporary insanity I would eventually overcome. David left that night, and as I listened to his footsteps fade down our front walk, I realized that the man I'd married had never really existed. The David who had comforted me through career setbacks, who had celebrated my achievements, who had cried over ultrasound photos, had been a performance designed to secure a supportive wife who would help him achieve his professional goal. Now that I needed support rather than providing it, now that I was broken rather than helpful, David had revealed his true nature. And for the first time since losing Isabella, I felt something other than grief. I felt the cold, clarifying anger of a woman who had been abandoned in her darkest hour by the person who had promised to love her unconditionally. The anger would sustain me through the months ahead, fueling discoveries that would shatter every remaining illusion I had about the man I'd married, and setting the stage for a revenge that would be as public and devastating as his betrayal had been private and cruel. The silence in our townhouse, after David left, was different from the grief-stricken quiet
that had filled our home since the miscarriage. This was the silence of abandonment, of a marriage that had just revealed its true nature when tested by genuine crisis. I sat in our living room, surrounded by the art collection we'd built together, and felt like a stranger in my own life.
For 3 days, I barely moved from the couch. I ordered food delivery, ignored calls from concerned friends, and stared at the walls where David's photographs used to hang. He'd taken them when he'd packed his bag, along with other personal items that had marked his presence in our shared space. The townhouse felt hollow, echoing with the ghosts of conversations we'd never have and the family we'd never become. On Saturday morning, my best friend Elena forced her way into my isolation by showing up at my door with coffee and bagels from the bakery near the museum, where we'd both started our careers 5 years earlier. "You look terrible," she said without preamble, pushing past me into the foyer. "And you smell like you haven't showered in days." Elena Rodriguez was my closest friend at the Contemporary Art Museum, a fellow curator who specialized in Latin American artists and had the kind of fierce loyalty that made her both a fierce ally and a formidable enemy. She'd been the first person I'd called when the miscarriage happened, and the only one who'd truly understood why David's reaction had been so devastating. "David called me," Elena said, unpacking breakfast in our kitchen with the familiarity of someone who'd spent countless evenings here during happier times. "He's worried about your mental state." I stared at her in disbelief. "He called you to say that you're having some kind of breakdown and refusing to be reasonable about moving forward after the pregnancy loss." Elena replied, her tone carefully neutral. "He wanted me to convince you to get professional help." The manipulation was breathtaking. David had abandoned me for grieving our daughter, then called my best friend to suggest I was mentally unstable for not recovering on his timeline. He was rewired history, positioning himself as the concerned husband, dealing with an irrational wife, rather than the man who had called me broken for mourning our child. "And what did you tell him?" I asked. Elena's expression darkened. "I told him that any man who leaves his wife alone after a miscarriage doesn't get to dictate how she processes grief." Then I hung up on him. For the first time in days, I felt something resembling relief. Elena understood what David had done, saw through his attempt to paint me as unstable rather than taking responsibility for his own cruelty. "He called me broken, Elena," I said, my voice hollow with the memory. "I lost our daughter, and he called me broken for needing time to grieve. He's a sociopath," Elena replied matter-of-factly, handing me coffee that was exactly how I liked it. "Normal people don't abandon their spouses during medical crises, then blame them for being upset about it." We spent the morning talking through everything that had happened since the miscarriage, and Elena helped me see patterns I'd been too devastated to recognize. David's immediate return to work, his irritation with my grief, his insistence that I was dwelling unnecessarily on our loss, all of it pointed to someone who lacked fundamental empathy rather than someone processing grief differently. The worst part, I admitted, is that I keep thinking about how excited he was during the pregnancy. He talked to Isabella every morning, planned her future, cried when we heard her heartbeat. How does someone go from that to calling her death no big deal? Elena considered this carefully. Maybe his excitement was never about the baby. Maybe it was about the image of himself as a successful family man. When the pregnancy ended, the image was gone, so his interest disappeared too. The observation was devastating in its accuracy. David's enthusiasm for fatherhood had always been tied to his vision of himself as a successful husband and father, not to genuine emotional connection with our unborn daughter. When Isabella died, she'd stopped serving his narrative, so she'd become expendable in his mind. "What are you going to do?" Elena asked as we finished breakfast. I realized I had no idea. For 6 years, every major decision had been made jointly with David. I'd never lived alone as an adult, had never navigated crisis without his input, had never imagined a future that didn't include our partnership. The woman I'd been before marriage felt like a stranger whose dreams and ambitions I could barely remember. "I don't know," I admit. "I don't even know who I am without him." "You're Victoria Chen," Elena said firmly, "the woman who revolutionized community engagement in contemporary art. the curator who brought national attention to underrepresented artists, the person who convinced the museum board to fund mobile galleries in underserved neighborhoods. You were all of those things before, David, and you still are now. Her words reminded me of the professional identity I'd maintained throughout my marriage, the career achievements that belonged entirely to me. While my personal life was in ruins, my professional reputation remained intact. The museum had granted me extended bereavement leave, but my work would be waiting when I was ready to return. Over the following weeks, Elena became my lifeline to the world outside my grief. She brought me updates from the museum, helped me maintain contact with colleagues who were concerned about my well-being, and gradually coaxed me back into social situations that didn't feel overwhelming. The first time I left the townhouse for something other than grocery shopping was to attend an exhibition opening at a small gallery in Wicker Park. Elena had convinced me that being around art again might help me reconnect with the part of myself that existed independently of my marriage. You don't have to stay long, she'd said, helping me choose an outfit from my professional wardrobe that still fit my post-miscarriage body. Just show up, remind yourself that there's a world full of beautiful things being created every day. The gallery was small and intimate, featuring emerging artists whose work explored themes of loss and renewal. As I stood before a series of paintings that depicted flowers growing through concrete, I felt something inside me shift slightly. The art wasn't trying to fix my grief or rush me through healing, but it was acknowledging that beauty could emerge from destruction, that creation could follow devastation. These are incredible, I said to Elena, studying a piece that showed delicate orchids pushing through cracks in abandoned buildings. The artist is Maria Santos, Elena replied. She's been documenting how nature reclaims urban spaces after economic collapse, kind of like how humans rebuild after personal collapse. The metaphor wasn't subtle, but it was effective. I spent an hour studying Maria's work, feeling my professional instincts reawaken as I analyzed her technique and considered how these pieces might fit into the museum's upcoming exhibitions on resilience and renewal. I want to meet her, I said suddenly. I think her work would be perfect for the spring contemporary showcase. Elena smiled. There's the Victoria I know. Should I make the introduction? Meeting Maria Santos that evening was the first purely professional conversation I'd had since the miscarriage, and it reminded me of the part of myself that existed independently of my role as David's wife. Maria was passionate about her art, articulate about her vision, and eager to discuss how galleries could better support emerging artists from marginalized communities. Your reputation precedes you, Maria said when Elena introduced us. The mobile gallery program you developed has been a model for museums across the country. That kind of innovation takes real vision. Hearing my professional achievements recognized by someone I respected reminded me that I had value beyond my ability to be a supportive spouse. While my marriage was ending, my career remained a source of meaning and identity that David couldn't take away from me. Over the following month, I began reconstructing my life piece by piece. I returned to work part-time, focusing on projects that energized me rather than simply fulfilling obligations. I started therapy with Dr. Sarah Martinez, a grief counselor who specialized in pregnancy loss and helped me understand that my mourning was not only normal but necessary for healing. Grief isn't something you get over, Dr. Martinez explained during one of our weekly sessions. It's something you learn to carry. The goal isn't to stop missing Isabella, but to integrate her memory into your life in a way that honors her while allowing you to move forward. The therapy sessions were painful but productive, helping me separate my grief over losing Isabella from my anger at David's abandonment. I learned that I could mourn our daughter while simultaneously recognizing that David's inability to support me through loss revealed fundamental problems with his character rather than defects in my own emotional processing. Your husband's reaction suggests someone who lacks empathy for genuine human suffering, Dr. Martinez observed after I'd described David's behavior following the miscarriage. That's not a temporary stress response. That's a personality trait that was probably always present but hidden during easier times. The insight was both validating and terrifying. If David lacked fundamental empathy, how much of our marriage had been performative? How many of his supportive gestures had been calculated rather than genuine? The questions led me to examine our relationship with new eyes, looking for patterns I'd missed while I was grateful for his attention and support. By February, 3 months after David had moved out, I was beginning to feel like myself again. Not the same person I'd been before losing Isabella, that woman was gone forever, but someone stronger and more self-aware than I'd ever been. The grief remained, would always remain, but it no longer consumed every moment of every day. That's when David called and asked to meet for coffee, claiming he had something important to discuss about our future. I agreed, partly out of curiosity, and partly because I needed closure about our marriage. We met at a neutral location, a cafe in downtown Chicago that held no memories of happier times. David looked good, I had to admit. His hair was perfectly styled, his suit expensive and well-tailored, his smile confident in the way that had first attracted me during college. But something about his appearance seemed calculated, as if he'd dressed carefully for this performance. "You look better," he said, studying my face with what appeared to be genuine concern. "More like yourself again." "Thank you," I replied carefully, unsure where this conversation was heading. "I've been thinking a lot about us," David continued, leaning forward with the intense focus he'd once used during our most intimate conversations, "about what happened after the miscarriage, about how we both handled that crisis. I think we made mistakes, Victoria, both of us." The inclusion of me in his assessment of blame was telling. Even now, David couldn't take full responsibility for abandoning me during the worst period of my life. He was already rewriting history to make our problems seem mutual rather than acknowledging his complete failure as a partner. "What kind of mistakes?" I asked, curious to hear his version of events. "I think I tried to move forward too quickly," David admitted, his tone carefully modulated to suggest deep reflection. "I was trying to protect both of us from prolonged pain, but I didn't realize how much you needed to process the loss, and I think you might have gotten stuck in grief longer than was healthy, which made it harder for us to support each other." The analysis was breathtaking in its self-serving distortion. David was presenting his abandonment as misguided protectiveness, while suggesting that my grief had been excessive and harmful to our marriage. He was positioning himself as someone who had learned from experience rather than someone who had revealed his true character under pressure. "So what are you suggesting?" I asked. David reached across the table and covered my hand with his. "I'm suggesting we try again, that we take what we've learned from this experience and use it to build a stronger marriage. I miss you, Victoria. I miss us." The gesture felt foreign after months of separation, his touch lacking the warmth I'd once associated with his affection. But more than that, his proposal felt like another performance, designed to restore the image of success he'd cultivated rather than address the fundamental problems that had destroyed our relationship. "Have you considered couples counseling?" I asked, testing his commitment to actually changing rather than simply resuming our previous dynamic. David's hesitation was brief but telling. "If you think it would help, sure, but honestly, Victoria, I think we can work through this ourselves. We're both intelligent, mature adults who understand what went wrong. Adding a third party might complicate things unnecessarily." His reluctance to seek professional help confirmed what I'd already suspected. David wasn't interested in examining his behavior or learning to be a better partner. He wanted to restore our marriage to its previous state without addressing the fundamental issues that had been exposed during our crisis. "I need time to think about it," I said, pulling my hand away from his. "Of course," David replied smoothly. "Take all the time you need. But don't take too long, Victoria. We've already lost months that we could have been rebuilding together." The subtle pressure in his tone reminded me of his negotiation tactics with difficult clients, applying just enough urgency to encourage quick decisions without appearing pushy. Everything about this conversation felt calculated rather than genuine, as if David had rehearsed his approach rather than speaking from authentic emotion. After he left, I sat in the cafe for another hour, processing what had just happened. David's offer to reconcile wasn't about love or genuine remorse. It was about restoring the comfortable life he'd enjoyed before our crisis. He missed having a supportive wife who enhanced his professional image, not the complicated reality of a woman who needed support during her darkest hour. That evening, I called Dr. Martinez to discuss David's proposal and my own confused feelings about it. "What did his offer make you feel?" she asked during our phone session. "Angry," I admitted, "and sad, because I realized that he doesn't actually understand what he did wrong." He thinks our problem was a communication breakdown rather than his complete lack of empathy when I needed him most. And how do you feel about the possibility of reconciling? I considered the question carefully. Terrified. Not because I'm afraid of being alone, but because I'm afraid of becoming that woman again, the one who needed his approval, who adjusted her life around his career, who believed that love meant making myself smaller so he could feel bigger. Dr. Martinez was quiet for a moment. It sounds like you've already made your decision. She was right. I had made my decision, though I hadn't consciously acknowledged it until that moment. I didn't want to reconcile with David because I didn't want to go back to being the person I'd been in our marriage. The woman who had emerged from grief and abandonment was stronger, more self-aware, and less willing to accept conditional love. I called David the next morning and told him I wanted a divorce. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine surprise. "You're throwing away 6 years of marriage without even trying to work things out." "I'm ending a marriage that couldn't survive the first real crisis we faced," I corrected. "You abandoned me when I needed you most, David. That's not something counseling can fix." There was a long pause before David spoke again, and when he did, his tone had shifted from conciliatory to coldly professional. "Fine. I'll have my lawyer contact yours about the divorce proceedings, but don't expect this to be easy, Victoria. You're the one choosing to end our marriage, so don't expect me to make this convenient for you." The threat was subtle but clear. David was warning me that he would make the divorce process as difficult as possible, using his financial resources and legal connections to punish me for rejecting his offer to reconcile. The man who had spent months claiming to love me was now revealing his willingness to wage war against me for refusing to accept his terms. "I wouldn't expect anything else from you," I replied calmly. "Your true character has been pretty clear since the day you called me broken for grieving our daughter." I hung up before he could respond, feeling lighter than I had in months. The decision was made. The die cast. I was getting divorced, and for the first time since losing Isabella, I felt genuinely hopeful about my future. The divorce proceedings began in earnest that spring, and David made good on his promise to make the process as punishing as possible. His lawyer was aggressive and expensive, challenging every aspect of our asset division and demanding detailed financial documentation that seemed designed more to exhaust my resources than to achieve fair settlement. "He's trying to wear you down," my attorney Julia Chen explained during one of our strategy sessions. "He knows you don't have unlimited funds for legal fees, so he's dragging out every negotiation hoping you'll eventually accept whatever he offers just to end the process." But I'd learned something about myself during the months since David left. I was stronger than either of us had realized. The woman who had survived losing Isabella and being abandoned by her husband wasn't going to be intimidated by legal maneuvering and financial pressure. "I'm not backing down," I told Julia. "I helped build his career just as much as he helped build mine. I deserve half of everything we accumulated during our marriage, and I'm willing to fight for it." The process was exhausting and expensive, but it was also educational. His discovery revealed financial information about David's career that I'd never seen before, including investment accounts and business partnerships I hadn't known existed. My husband hadn't just been emotionally distant during our marriage, he'd been systematically hiding assets and planning for a future that didn't include me. "Look at this," Julia said during one of our meetings, pointing to bank statements that showed regular transfers to accounts in David's name only. "He's been moving money into personal accounts for over 2 years. This suggests he's been planning an exit strategy long before your miscarriage." The revelation was devastating but not entirely surprising. David's quick abandonment of our marriage hadn't been an impulsive response to crisis. It had been the culmination of years of emotional withdrawal and financial preparation. The man I'd been married to had been planning his escape while I'd been planning our family. By summer, the divorce was finalized with a settlement that gave me the townhouse, half of our joint assets, and a substantial portion of David's retirement account. More importantly, I retained full rights to the art collection we'd built together, pieces that represented some of my best curatorial decisions, and would form the foundation of my personal collection as my career continued to evolve. David was furious about the settlement,
particularly the loss of artwork he'd grown to see as investments rather than cultural artifacts. But Julia had successfully argued that the collection represented my professional expertise rather than our joint financial contributions, and the judge had agreed. "Enjoy your blood money," David had said after the final hearing, his mask of professional civility finally slipping completely. "You destroyed our marriage for money and artwork. I hope it was worth it." The accusation was projection of the highest order. David was the one who had abandoned our marriage when it became inconvenient, who had hidden assets while planning his escape, who had valued money and image over genuine partnership. But like all narcissists, he was incapable of acknowledging his own failures and needed to paint me as the villain in our story. "I didn't destroy our marriage for money," I replied calmly. "I ended our marriage because you showed me who you really are when I needed you most. The money is just compensation for the years I spent building a life with someone who was incapable of real love." Walking out of that courthouse as a divorced woman felt like the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. I was 33 years old, financially secure, professionally successful, and completely free to build whatever life I wanted without consulting anyone else's preferences or timeline. The first year of my post-divorce life was dedicated to rediscovering who I was as an individual rather than half of a couple. I threw myself into work with renewed passion, developing innovative exhibitions that pushed the boundaries of how contemporary art could address social issues. The museum board approved my proposal for a major exhibition on art and resilience that would feature artists who had created powerful work in response to personal or collective trauma. "This is your best work yet," Elena said as we reviewed the exhibition plans in my office at the museum. "You're curating from a place of genuine understanding rather than academic theory." She was right. My own experience with loss and recovery had given me insights into how art could serve as both witness to suffering and pathway to healing. The exhibition would feature artists like Maria Santos, whose work I'd first encountered during my early recovery, alongside established figures who had used their craft to process grief, displacement, and renewal. As the exhibition took shape, I found myself thinking less about David and more about the future I was creating entirely on my own terms. The townhouse had been transformed from a shrine to our failed marriage into a space that reflected my individual taste and interest. I'd repainted the nursery and converted it into a home office, where I could work on freelance curatorial projects and write the book about contemporary art and social engagement that I'd been planning since graduate school. My social life expanded to include people who knew me only as Victoria, the curator, not Victoria the divorced woman or Victoria the grieving mother. I joined a book club focused on art criticism, took weekend photography classes to better understand visual composition, and began traveling again to art fairs and exhibitions, without needing to coordinate my schedule with anyone else's preferences. The freedom was intoxicating. For the first time in my adult life, I could make decisions based purely on my own interests and goals. I could accept last-minute invitations to gallery openings, could spend entire weekends reading in bed without feeling guilty about neglecting household responsibilities, could plan vacations to places David would have found boring or impractical. It was during one of these solo adventures, a long weekend in Santa Fe exploring the city's vibrant gallery scene, that I met someone who would change my perspective on what healthy relationships could look like. His name was Carlos Mendoza, and he was a photographer specializing in architectural documentation for Preservation Society. We met at a gallery opening featuring contemporary interpretations of traditional Native American art, where Carlos was photographing installations for a book about cultural preservation in the modern Southwest. "Excuse me," he said, approaching me as I studied a mixed media piece that incorporated traditional weaving techniques with contemporary materials. "I'm documenting this exhibition for publication, and I noticed you've been studying this piece for several minutes.
Would you mind sharing what draws you to it? I like to include viewer perspectives in my documentation." His approach was professional but warm, and something about his genuine curiosity made me feel comfortable sharing my thoughts with a stranger. The way the artist has integrated traditional techniques with contemporary materials creates a conversation between past and present, I explained, gesturing toward the intricate details that had captured my attention. It's not appropriation or pastiche, but genuine dialogue between cultural traditions and modern artistic expression. Carlos nodded thoughtfully, making notes in a small notebook. "Are you an artist yourself?" Curator, I replied. Contemporary art, with a focus on community engagement and cultural representation. That explains the sophisticated analysis, Carlos said with a smile that seemed genuinely appreciative, rather than flirtatious. I'm Carlos Mendoza, architectural photographer. I specialize in documenting buildings and spaces for historical preservation societies. We spent the next hour touring the exhibition together, Carlos asking thoughtful questions about the curatorial decisions, while I learned about his approach to photographing art in ways that captured both aesthetic beauty and cultural context. His perspective was refreshing, focused on preserving and celebrating cultural heritage, rather than simply documenting it for commercial purposes. Would you like to get coffee and continue this conversation? Carlos asked as the gallery began closing. I'm always interested in learning from people who understand art from different angles than my own. Coffee led to dinner, which led to a long walk through Santa Fe's historic district, where Carlos pointed out architectural details I would have missed, and I shared insights about how public art installations could enhance, rather than compete with historical surroundings. The conversation was intellectually stimulating without being competitive, collaborative rather than performative. I have to admit, Carlos said as we paused in front of a beautifully restored adobe building, this is the most interesting conversation I've had in months. Most people I meet professionally are either trying to sell me something or impress me with their credentials. I know the feeling, I replied, realizing that I was enjoying myself in a way I hadn't experienced since college. It's refreshing to talk to someone who's genuinely passionate about their work, rather than just pursuing career advancement. Carlos was different from David in ways that went beyond their different professions. Where David had been calculating and image-conscious, Carlos seemed genuinely interested in cultural preservation for its own value, rather than personal advancement. Where David had dominated conversations with his opinions and expertise, Carlos asked questions and listened to answers with apparent genuine interest. What brings you to Santa Fe? Carlos asked as we headed back toward the hotel district where we were both staying. Solo exploration, I admitted. I'm recently divorced and rediscovering what I enjoy when I don't have to coordinate with anyone else's preferences. Carlos nodded with understanding. Divorce can be liberating once you get past the initial trauma. How long has it been? Finalized about 6 months ago. The marriage ended over a year ago, when my husband decided that my grief over a miscarriage was inconvenient for his career timeline. I was surprised by my own honesty. I'd shared more personal information with this stranger than I'd revealed to colleagues I'd known for years, but something about Carlos's demeanor made me feel safe being authentic, rather than maintaining professional composure. I'm sorry, Carlos said, both for the loss of your pregnancy and for being abandoned when you needed support. That takes a special kind of selfishness. The observation was matter-of-fact rather than pitying, acknowledging both losses without trying to fix or minimize either. It was the kind of response I'd hoped for from David but had never received. Thank you, I said. It's taken me a while to understand that his inability to support me said more about his character than about my worthiness of support. Absolutely, Carlos agreed. Real partnership means showing up for the difficult times, not just celebrating the easy ones. We exchanged contact information before parting ways that evening, and over the following weeks, Carlos and I maintained a friendship through email and occasional phone calls. He was working on a book about architectural preservation in the Southwest and would send me photos of buildings and installations he was documenting, while I shared updates about the Art and Resilience exhibition I was developing. The correspondence was casual and professional, but it was also consistent in ways that felt rare in my experience. Carlos followed through on promises to send information, remembered details from previous conversations, and showed genuine interest in my work without trying to insert himself into my professional sphere. You seem lighter lately, Elena observed one afternoon as we reviewed exhibition layouts in my office. More like the Victoria I knew before you got married. I feel more like myself, I admitted. I'm remembering what it feels like to make decisions without worrying about how they'll affect someone else's plans or image. And the photographer from Santa Fe, I'd mentioned Carlos to Elena during one of our weekly lunches, describing him as an interesting professional contact rather than acknowledging the personal connection that was gradually developing between us. We're friends, I said. which was technically true even if it didn't capture the full complexity of my feelings. Friends who talk on the phone for 2 hours every weekend. Elena raised an eyebrow with the skeptical expression I'd learned to recognize over years of friendship. She was right to be skeptical. My conversations with Carlos had evolved from professional exchanges to personal discussions about art, travel, family backgrounds, and life philosophy. I found myself looking forward to his calls and feeling disappointed when work obligations prevented our usual weekend conversations. "I'm not ready for anything romantic," I said, which was also true even as I acknowledged that my feelings for Carlos were becoming more than platonic. "That's fine," Elena replied, "but don't use fear of relationships to talk yourself out of genuine connection with someone who seems to actually appreciate you." The observation stayed with me as I prepared for the Art and Resilience exhibition open. Carlos had offered to fly to Chicago to document the opening for potential inclusion in a book about innovative museum programming, and I'd accepted his proposal partly for professional reasons, and partly because I wanted to see him again. The exhibition opening was scheduled for a Friday evening in October, exactly 1 year after David had moved out of our townhouse. The timing felt symbolic, marking the anniversary of my marriage's end with a celebration of creative work born from struggle and recovery. The gallery spaces looked magnificent. Maria Santos's paintings of flowers growing through urban decay were displayed alongside photographs of communities rebuilding after natural disasters, sculptures created from debris of demolished buildings, and video installations that captured stories of personal and collective resilience. The work was beautiful but not sanitized, acknowledging pain while celebrating the human capacity for renewal. "This is extraordinary," Carlos said as we walked through the galleries during the preview hour before guests arrived. "You've created something that's both aesthetically beautiful and emotionally honest. This exhibition doesn't minimize suffering or promise easy healing, but it shows how creativity can emerge from the darkest experience." His understanding of what I'd tried to achieve with the exhibition felt validating in ways I hadn't expected. David had never shown genuine interest in my curatorial work beyond its potential to advance his own social and professional goals. Carlos seemed to appreciate the exhibition for its artistic and cultural value, rather than its potential benefit to him. "Thank you," I said, feeling genuinely moved by his response. "This exhibition represents everything I've learned about art's capacity to witness and transform trauma. It's the most personal work I've ever done professionally." "It shows," Carlos replied. "You can feel the authenticity in every curatorial decision. This isn't art about resilience created by someone who read about it in textbooks. This is art about resilience curated by someone who's lived it." The opening reception was attended by art critics, museum donors, community leaders, and artists whose work was featured in the exhibition. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with several critics praising the exhibition's sophisticated approach to difficult subjects and its success in creating dialogue rather than simply documenting trauma. "Victoria, this is remarkable work," said Dr. Patricia Williams, the museum's director, as we stood near Maria Santos's centerpiece installation. "The board is already discussing how we can develop this into a traveling exhibition that could reach museums nationwide." The professional validation felt wonderful, but what meant more to me was watching visitors engage with the artwork in ways that suggested genuine emotional connection rather than polite appreciation. I saw people crying in front of certain pieces, photographing others to share with friends, and having intense conversations about how art could help process personal experiences with loss and recovery. "You've created something that matters," Carlos observed as we watched an elderly woman spend nearly 30 minutes studying a sculpture created from debris of a demolished church. "This isn't just pretty objects in a gallery. This is art that's actually helping people process their own experiences." As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Carlos and I found ourselves alone in the main gallery, surrounded by the artwork that represented months of careful planning and emotional investment. "I have something to tell you," Carlos said, his expression more serious than I'd seen it during our months of friendship. My stomach tightened with familiar anxiety. The last time a man had announced he had something important to tell me, it had preceded the complete destruction of my life as I'd known it. "What is it?" I asked, bracing myself for disappointment or betrayal. I've been offered a position with a preservation society in Chicago, Carlos said. It would mean relocating from Santa Fe permanently, and I wanted you to know that you're a significant factor in my decision to accept it. The admission hung in the air between us, honest and vulnerable in ways that felt both terrifying and promising. Carlos, I began, but he held up a hand to stop me. I'm not asking you for anything, he said quickly. I'm not asking you to define our relationship or make promises about the future. I just wanted you to know that meeting you has changed how I think about what I want my life to look like, and I'd like the opportunity to explore that if you're interested. His approach was so different from David's manipulative pressure or emotional ultimatums that I needed a moment to process what he was actually offering. Carlos wasn't demanding immediate decisions or threatening consequences if I didn't respond enthusiastically. He was simply being honest about his feelings, while giving me complete freedom to respond according to my own timeline and comfort level. I'm interested, I said, surprising myself with how certain I felt. I'm also terrified, but I'm interested. Carlos smiled, and something about his expression reminded me that healthy relationships could be built on honesty and mutual respect, rather than performance and manipulation. Terrified is understandable, he said. We can take things as slowly as you need. Canning in that gallery surrounded by art about resilience and renewal, I realized that my capacity for love hadn't been destroyed by David's betrayal. It had been refined, strengthened, and made more discerning. I was ready to try again, but this time with someone who had demonstrated the ability to support rather than exploit my vulnerability. The decision to give Carlos a chance would prove to be one of the best choices I'd made in years, but it would also set in motion events that would force me to confront David again in ways I never could have anticipated. Because while I was learning to trust again, my ex-husband was building a life that would soon collide with mine in the most public and devastating way possible. Carlos relocated to Chicago in November, and we began dating with the careful consideration of two people who had learned not to rush toward intensity without building genuine foundation first. Unlike my whirlwind courtship with David, my relationship with Carlos developed slowly and deliberately, with both of us committed to maintaining our individual identities while exploring our compatibility. Our first official date was appropriately art-focused, a photography exhibition at a small gallery in Pilsen, followed by dinner at a Mexican restaurant. Carlos had researched specifically because the owners were known for supporting local artists by displaying their work alongside traditional decor. I've never dated a curator before, Carlos admitted over dinner. Is there protocol for dating someone whose professional opinion could make or break an artist's career? I laughed, appreciating both his humor and his recognition of the ethical considerations involved in our respective professions. I've never dated a photographer either. Is there protocol for dating someone who could document my most unflattering moments for posterity? I promise to only photograph you with optimal lighting and flattering angles, Carlos said with mock solemnity. Professional courtesy. The conversation flowed as naturally as it had during our first meeting in Santa Fe, but now it was layered with the awareness that we were exploring romantic possibility rather than simply enjoying intellectual compatibility. Carlos asked about my work, my recovery from divorce, my thoughts on contemporary art trends, my relationship with my family, questions that suggested genuine interest in understanding me, rather than collecting information that could be used strategically. What about children? Carlos asked during dessert, his tone careful but direct. Is that something you still want, or has your experience changed your perspective? The question was difficult but necessary, and I appreciated his willingness to address it directly rather than avoiding the subject because of its complexity. I still want children, I said slowly, but I want them with someone who would be a genuine partner in parenting, not someone who sees children as accessories to a successful image. My miscarriage taught me that pregnancy and parenthood involve real risks and genuine vulnerability, and I need to know that my partner would support me through difficulties, rather than abandon me when things get challenging. Carlos nodded thoughtfully. I want children too, and I want them with someone who understands that parenting is about the children's well-being, not the parent's ego. It was exactly the right answer, demonstrating both shared values and awareness of the factors that had destroyed my previous marriage. Over the following months, Carlos and I established routines that honored both our professional commitments and our developing relationship. He would attend gallery openings with me when his schedule permitted, offering insights about visual composition that enhanced my understanding of how artwork functioned in exhibition spaces. I would accompany him to architectural documentation projects when possible, learning about building preservation while gaining new appreciation for how photographers captured spaces that might otherwise be lost to time and development. "You have good instincts about composition," Carlos observed one Saturday, as we documented a Depression-era theater that was scheduled for demolition. "Have you ever considered photography as a complement to your curatorial work?" "Never seriously," I admitted, studying the ornate ceiling details through his camera viewfinder, "but I can see how understanding photographic techniques could help me plan exhibitions more effectively. I could teach you," Carlos offered. "Not because I think you need another skill, but because I think you'd enjoy it." The offer was generous without being presumptuous, suggesting shared activity rather than improvement project. Everything about Carlos's approach to our relationship felt collaborative rather than corrective, supportive rather than possessive. By spring, Carlos and I had settled into what felt like a mature, sustainable relationship built on mutual respect and shared interests, rather than desperate need or strategic partnership. We maintained separate apartments but spent most weekends together, traveling to document architectural sites or visit galleries and museums throughout the Midwest. "You seem happy," Dr. Martinez observed during one of our monthly therapy sessions. "More settled than I've seen you since we started working together." "I am happy," I agreed. Not the intense, desperate happiness I felt during the early years with David, but something calmer and more sustainable. "I feel like myself when I'm with Carlos, not like a performance version of myself." "That's significant growth," Dr. Martinez said. "You've learned to recognize the difference between healthy partnership and codependent performance." The observation was accurate. My relationship with Carlos didn't require me to minimize my ambitions or adjust my personality to maintain his interest. He celebrated my professional successes without taking credit for them, and supported my goals without trying to redirect them toward his own benefit. It was this sense of security and authentic partnership that made what happened next so particularly devastating. Because while I was learning to trust again and building a healthy relationship, David was constructing a public image that would soon require my complete destruction to maintain. The first hint that David was planning something came in the form of a phone call from Elena in early May. "Have you seen the Tribune article about rising stars in Chicago finance?" she asked without preamble when I answered my phone. "No." "David is featured as one of the city's most promising young executives. The article mentions his recent promotion and his innovative approach to ethical investing, but it also includes personal details that might interest you." I felt my stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. "What kind of personal details?" He's quoted discussing how his recent divorce taught him about resilience and personal growth. According to the article, he's learned valuable lessons about work-life balance and is looking forward to building a family with someone who shares his values. The manipulation was breathtaking. David was using our divorce as evidence of his emotional maturity and growth, positioning himself as someone who had learned from past mistakes rather than someone who had revealed his true character under pressure. More disturbing was his reference to building a family, which suggested he was already planning his next relationship strategy. "There's more," Elena continued. "The article mentions that he's been selected to receive the Corporate Excellence Award from the Chicago Business Council next month. It's a significant honor that comes with substantial media coverage." I knew about the Corporate Excellence Award, a prestigious recognition given annually to business leaders who demonstrated both professional success and community impact. Recipients were featured in major publications, invited to speak at industry conferences, and generally elevated to celebrity status within Chicago's business community. "Good for him," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral despite the complicated emotions the news triggered. "Victoria," Elena said gently, "I'm telling you this because I think you should be prepared. If David is being positioned as a rising star in ethical business practices,
he's going to need to explain his personal life in ways that support that image. His abandonment of you after the miscarriage doesn't fit the narrative of someone who's learned valuable lessons about work-life balance. She was right. David's public image as an ethical, family-oriented executive would be seriously damaged if the truth about our divorce became public knowledge. The man who was being celebrated for his values-driven approach to business had abandoned his wife for grieving their miscarried daughter. The contradiction would be impossible to reconcile with his carefully constructed professional image. Are you suggesting he might try to rewrite the history of our marriage? I asked. I'm suggesting he might try to rewrite the history of your divorce, Elena replied, and that might require making you look like the villain in the story. The warning proved prophetic. Over the following weeks, I began hearing rumors through mutual professional contacts that painted a very different picture of our marriage and divorce than what had actually happened. According to these stories, David had been a devoted husband whose career success had been overshadowed by his wife's mental health struggles following a tragic pregnancy loss. In this version of events, I had become increasingly unstable and demanding, ultimately forcing David to choose between his own well-being and an unhealthy marriage. I heard from someone at the Art Institute that your ex-husband has been telling people you had a complete breakdown after your miscarriage, Maria Santos mentioned during a coffee meeting about her upcoming solo exhibition. According to his version, you became impossible to live with and refused to get professional help. The lies were strategic and devastating. David was positioning himself as the long-suffering husband who had tried everything to save our marriage, before finally accepting that I was too damaged to be a suitable partner. By spreading these stories through professional networks, he was attempting to control the narrative before anyone had a chance to hear my perspective. That's not what happened, I said, though I realized how difficult it would be to prove the truth without seeming defensive or unstable. I know it's not, Maria replied. Anyone who knows you professionally can see that you're not only stable but thriving, but people who don't know you personally might believe whatever version they hear first. The character assassination campaign was subtle but effective. David wasn't directly attacking my professional competence, which would have been easily disproven by my recent successes. Instead, he was attacking my personal stability and emotional maturity, areas that were harder to defend publicly without seeming to confirm the very instability he was alleged. This is harassment, Carlos said when I told him about the rumors that were circulating through Chicago's interconnected professional community. He's deliberately trying to damage your reputation to protect his own image. But what can I do about it? I asked. If I start defending myself publicly, I'll look exactly as unstable as he's claiming I am. If I ignore it, the rumors become accepted truth. Carlos was quiet for a moment, considering the dilemma. Maybe the answer isn't defending yourself. Maybe the answer is letting David's own behavior expose his character. I wasn't sure what he meant, but I was about to find out. Because David's campaign to rewrite our history was just the beginning of a much larger performance designed to cement his image as Chicago's most eligible and successful young executive. And that performance would require a public demonstration of his transformation that would give me the perfect opportunity for revenge. The invitation arrived in early June, delivered by courier to my office at the museum. It was printed on heavy cream cardstock with elegant typography, formally requesting my attendance at the Corporate Excellence Awards ceremony where David Morrison would be recognized for his contributions to ethical business practices and community development. You have got to be kidding me, Elena said when I showed her the invitation later that afternoon. He's actually inviting you to watch him receive an award for being an outstanding citizen. The audacity was breathtaking. After months of spreading rumors about my mental instability, David was inviting me to publicly witness his professional triumph. The invitation could be interpreted as magnanimous gesture from someone who harbored no ill will toward his ex-wife, but I suspected it was something more calculated. He wants me there, I realized. If I attend, I validate his narrative that we ended things amicably and that he's moved on to bigger and better things. If I don't attend, I look petty and bitter. So don't go, Carlos suggested when I shared the invitation with him that evening. You don't owe David or anyone else your presence at his celebration, but something about the invitation bothered me beyond its obvious manipulation. There was a note handwritten on the bottom in David's familiar script. It would mean a great deal to have you there. This honor belongs to both of us. considering how much your support contributed to my success." The message was designed to appear gracious while actually claiming credit for achievements that had occurred entirely after our separation. David was suggesting that his current recognition was somehow the result of support I'd provided during our marriage, making my attendance seem like a natural celebration of our shared success rather than his individual achievement. "He's trying to have it both ways," I explained to Dr. Martinez during our next session. "He wants to take credit for learning and growing from our divorce while also suggesting that his success is partially due to my previous support. He's rewriting history to make himself look both independent and supported, both a victim of my instability and a beneficiary of my contribution."
Martinez frowned. That's a sophisticated level of manipulation. He's creating a narrative where you're simultaneously the problem in his past and the solution to his success. The psychological manipulation was exhausting to untangle, but it also revealed something important about David's current situation. If he was working this hard to control the narrative around our divorce, it meant he had something significant to protect. The Corporate Excellence Award was clearly more important to his future plans than I'd initially understood. I decided to attend the ceremony, partly out of curiosity about David's current life, and partly because I'd realized that refusing to go would only confirm whatever story he was telling about my bitterness and instability. If I was going to be part of his performance, I might as well see it firsthand. "Are you sure about this?" Carlos asked, as I prepared for the award ceremony, which was being held at the Palmer House Hotel, where David had stayed after leaving our marriage. "I'm sure," I said, adjusting the simple black dress I'd chosen for the evening. "I want to see what David's been building since our divorce, and I want him to see that I'm not the broken woman he's been describing to people." Carlos offered to accompany me, but I declined. This was something I needed to do alone, a final confrontation with the man who had defined so much of my adult life before abandoning me when I'd needed him most. The Palmer House ballroom was elegant and formal, filled with Chicago's business elite, and decorated with floral arrangements that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries. I recognized many faces from charity galas and cultural events I'd attended with David during our marriage, people who nodded politely when they saw me, but seemed uncertain about how to interact with the divorced wife of the evening's honoree. David looked magnificent. I had to admit, his tuxedo was perfectly tailored, his hair styled with the kind of precision that suggested professional attention, and his smile radiated the confidence of someone who was exactly where he belonged. He worked the room with practiced charm, shaking hands and accepting congratulations with the smooth professionalism that had first attracted me during college. "Victoria," he said when he spotted me near the bar where I was nursing a glass of wine and observing the crowd, "you came." "I wasn't sure you would." "You invited me," I replied simply. "Congratulations on the award. It's quite an honor." "Thank you," David said, his expression suggesting genuine pleasure at my attendance. "I meant what I wrote on the invitation. Your support during the early years of my career was invaluable. This recognition really does belong to both of us." The magnanimous statement was clearly intended for the benefit of nearby guests, who were undoubtedly curious about how the divorced couple was interacting. David was performing the role of gracious ex-husband who appreciated his former wife's contributions while demonstrating that he'd moved beyond any bitterness about their separation. "I'm glad you found your path to success," I said, matching his public tone while noting how his eyes held none of the warmth I'd once associated with his genuine affection. Everything about this interaction felt rehearsed, designed for public consumption rather than authentic communication. "Actually," David continued, leaning closer with what appeared to be confidential intimacy, "there's someone I'd like you to meet, someone very special who's been incredibly supportive during this transition period." My stomach dropped as David gestured toward a young woman approaching us through the crowd. She was stunning in the way that only 20-something women could be, with long auburn hair, bright green eyes, and the kind of confident smile that suggested she was accustomed to being the most beautiful person in any room. Her emerald cocktail dress was expensive and perfectly fitted, her jewelry understated but clearly valuable. "Victoria, I'd like you to meet Jessica Williams," David said, his voice carrying unmistakable pride. "Jessica, this is my ex-wife Victoria, the curator I've told you so much about. Jessica extended her hand with a warm smile that seemed genuinely friendly rather than territorial. It's wonderful to finally meet you, Victoria. David speaks about you with such respect. He's told me how much your support meant during his early career development. The introduction was flawlessly executed, presenting Jessica as someone who appreciated rather than threatened by David's previous merit. But something about her demeanor suggested she was performing just as carefully as David, playing the role of gracious new girlfriend who harbored no insecurity about her predecessor. How long have you two been together? I asked, genuinely curious about the timeline of their relationship. About 8 months, Jessica replied, glancing at David with obvious affection. We met through mutual friends at a charity gala last fall. The timeline made my blood run cold. David and I had been officially divorced for only 10 months, which meant he'd started dating Jessica almost immediately after our separation was finalized. More troubling was the possibility that their relationship had begun even earlier, while our divorce was still being negotiated. Jessica works in public relations for healthcare organizations, David added, his arm sliding around her waist in a gesture that was both possessive and performative. She's been instrumental in helping me understand how to better communicate my values to both clients and the community. The description made Jessica sound like a strategic asset rather than a romantic partner, someone whose professional skills complemented David's career goal. Everything about their presentation felt calculated to demonstrate David's emotional growth and professional advancement, rather than genuine affection between two people who had found each other. That sounds like meaningful work, I said to Jessica, noting how she seemed to glow under David's attention in ways that reminded me of my own early relationship with him. It is, Jessica agreed enthusiastically. I've been so impressed by David's commitment to ethical business practices. He's shown me how finance can be a force for positive social change rather than just wealth accumulation. The statement was clearly rehearsed, designed to reinforce David's public image as a values-driven executive, but it also revealed something important about Jessica's role in his life. She wasn't just his girlfriend. She was his public relations asset, someone whose youth and beauty enhanced his image while her professional expertise helped him craft the perfect narrative. Well, I should let you both get back to your celebration, I said, suddenly desperate to escape this performance of perfect happiness and professional success. Actually, David said, glancing around the ballroom with obvious satisfaction, the formal program is about to begin. You should stay for the award presentation. I think you'll find my speech particularly meaningful. There was something in his tone that suggested the speech would contain information I needed to hear, though I couldn't imagine what David might say publicly that would be relevant to me personally. Against my better judgment, I found myself agreeing to stay through the ceremony. The award presentation began with a video tribute highlighting David's professional achievements and community involvement. Images of him speaking at conferences, volunteering at charity events, and meeting with community leaders filled the large screens flanking the stage. The narrative painted a picture of someone who had overcome personal challenges to achieve remarkable success while maintaining strong ethical principles. David Morrison represents the best of Chicago's next generation of business leaders, the narrator intoned over footage of David in his office, looking thoughtful and determined. His commitment to work-life balance and family values has been shaped by personal experiences that taught him the importance of supporting those we love through life's most difficult challenges. The irony was staggering. David was being celebrated for family values and supporting loved ones through difficulties, qualities he'd completely failed to demonstrate during our marriage's darkest hour. The award committee had clearly bought into his revised narrative about learning and growing from personal setbacks rather than understanding the truth about his character. When David took the stage to accept his award, the applause was thunderous. He looked confident and humble simultaneously, exactly the right combination for someone receiving recognition for both professional excellence and personal integrity. Thank you for this incredible honor, David began, his voice carrying easily through the ballroom sound system. This award represents not just my individual achievements, but the support of everyone who has believed in the possibility of ethical business practices that benefit both shareholders and society. The opening was predictably professional, hitting all the expected notes about teamwork and community support. But as David continued speaking, His tone became more personal and reflective. "I want to speak honestly about the personal journey that brought me to this moment," David said, his expression growing more serious. "3 years ago, I went through one of the most challenging periods of my life. My wife and I experienced the devastating loss of a pregnancy, and that tragedy tested our marriage in ways neither of us was prepared for." My stomach lurched as David began publicly discussing our miscarriage and divorce. Around me, I could feel other guests shifting uncomfortably as the speech took this unexpectedly intimate turn. "I'm not proud to admit that I initially handled that crisis poorly," David continued, his voice breaking slightly with what appeared to be genuine emotion. "I was so focused on trying to fix the problem and move forward that I failed to provide the emotional support my wife needed during her grieving process. My inability to be present for her pain ultimately led to the end of our marriage." The admission was masterfully crafted, acknowledging fault while simultaneously positioning himself as someone who had learned from his mistake. David was confessing to being emotionally unavailable rather than cruel, describing his abandonment as misguided problem-solving rather than callous selfishness. "That experience taught me that true leadership means showing up for the difficult moments, not just celebrating the victories," David said, looking directly at me in the audience. "It taught me that supporting the people we love requires patience, empathy, and the willingness to sit with pain rather than immediately trying to solve it." The crowd murmured appreciatively as David appeared to take full responsibility for our marriage's failure while demonstrating the emotional growth that had made him worthy of this recognition. It was a perfect performance that would enhance his reputation while making any criticism from me seem petty and vindictive. "I share this personal story because it fundamentally changed how I approach both my professional relationships and my commitment to family," David continued. "The woman I'm honored to call my partner today has helped me understand what real partnership looks like. Jessica Williams has shown me that love means supporting each other's dreams while building something beautiful together." The spotlight found Jessica in the audience, and she smiled radiantly as applause filled the ballroom. David was using our tragedy and his learned lessons to publicly celebrate his new relationship, turning our loss into the foundation story for his next chapter. "But there's something else I want to share tonight," David said, his voice taking on a tone of joyful anticipation. "Something that represents the completion of this journey from heartbreak to healing, from failure to renewal." My blood turned to ice as I realized what was coming next. "Jessica and I are thrilled to announce that we're expecting our first child together," David said, his face glowing with obvious happiness. "This baby represents everything I've learned about love, partnership, and the responsibility we have to support each other through every moment of this incredible journey." The ballroom erupted in congratulations and applause as Jessica stood and placed her hand on what I now realized was a small but noticeable bump beneath her emerald dress. She was probably 4 months pregnant, which meant she'd conceived around the time David was spreading rumors about my mental instability following our miscarriage. The cruelty of the announcement was breathtaking. David had taken the stage at his professional triumph to publicly celebrate expecting a child with another woman, using lessons learned from abandoning me during our pregnancy loss to demonstrate his growth and readiness for fatherhood. He was literally building his new family's foundation story on the grave of our daughter Isabella. "This award belongs not just to me but to my devoted partner Jessica, who stands by me through every challenge," David concluded, blowing a kiss toward Jessica as she beamed from the audience. "And to everyone who believes that our greatest failures can become our most important teachers." As David left the stage to thunderous applause, I sat frozen in my seat, processing the magnitude of what had just happened. David hadn't just moved on from our marriage, he'd weaponized our tragedy to enhance his public image and celebrate his new relationship. Our daughter's death had become a character development plot point in his success story. But as I watched David return to Jessica's side, accepting congratulations from colleagues and friends who praised his honesty and emotional maturity, I realized something that filled me with cold determination rather than devastation. David had just made a critical mistake. In his eagerness to demonstrate his transformation and celebrate his new life, he'd provided me with information that would destroy everything he'd worked to build. Because while David was publicly celebrating his pregnancy with Jessica and taking credit for learning valuable lessons about partnership, I had information that would expose him as exactly the same selfish, manipulative person he'd always been. Information that would shatter his carefully constructed image in front of everyone who mattered to his career. I knew about Emma Morrison, the 3-year-old daughter David had never mentioned to Jessica, to the award committee, or to any of the colleagues currently congratulating him on his emotional growth and readiness for fatherhood. Emma, whose existence I'd discovered 6 months earlier through the private investigator I'd hired to verify David's hidden assets during our divorce proceedings. Detective Mills had uncovered much more than financial irregularities during her investigation. She'd found evidence of a relationship that predated our marriage, a brief affair with a woman named Sarah Chen during David's graduate school years that had resulted in a pregnancy Sarah had chosen to handle independently. David had been paying substantial child support for Emma since her birth, money that had been carefully hidden from our joint finances through a complex system of business accounts and legal trust. Sarah Chen was a successful attorney who had never wanted anything from David beyond financial support for their daughter. She'd raised Emma alone, apparently preferring to maintain distance from David rather than complicate her life with his presence. The arrangement had suited David perfectly, allowing him to financially fulfill his obligations, while maintaining complete secrecy about Emma's existence. I discovered the truth about Emma during the final stages of our divorce proceeding when Detective Mills had presented me with photographs of David visiting a playground in Lincoln Park where he occasionally spent supervised time with a beautiful little girl who unmistakably shared his distinctive gray eyes and dark hair. "Your ex-husband has been maintaining this relationship for over 3 years," Detective Mills had explained, showing me documentation of regular support payments and scheduled visits. "According to my investigation, he sees the child approximately once per month, always at neutral locations, and has never acknowledged her existence to anyone in his current social or professional circles." The discovery had been devastating for different reasons than his affair or abandonment. Learning that David was capable of loving and supporting a child while refusing to grieve our lost daughter revealed depths of compartmentalization and selfishness that I'd never imagined possible. He'd been a father all along, just not to our baby. I'd chosen not to use Emma's existence during our divorce proceedings, partly because I didn't want to involve an innocent child in our legal battles, and partly because David's financial obligations to her were already legally established. But I'd kept Detective Mills's documentation, understanding instinctively that information about David's secret daughter might someday prove valuable. Tonight, watching David accept an award for family values while celebrating his pregnancy with Jessica, I realized that someday had arrived. David had built his entire public image on the narrative of learning from past mistakes and growing into someone worthy of love and family. His corporate excellence award, his relationship with Jessica, his professional reputation, all of it depended on people believing that he was the transformed man he'd presented in his speech tonight. The existence of Emma destroyed that narrative completely. David hadn't learned valuable lessons about supporting loved ones through difficult times. He'd simply hidden his failures more effectively. He hadn't grown into someone ready for the responsibilities of fatherhood. He'd been shirking those responsibilities for years while maintaining perfect public deniability. As the award ceremony concluded and guests moved toward the reception area, I remained in my seat, watching David and Jessica accept congratulations on both his professional recognition and their pregnancy announcement. They looked perfect together, the successful executive and his beautiful, accomplished partner embarking on their journey toward parenthood with all the wisdom gained from past experience. But I knew something that would shatter that perfect image in front of everyone who mattered to David's career. The question wasn't whether to use that information but how to deploy it for maximum impact. Standing up from my seat, I walked toward the reception area where David and Jessica were surrounded by well-wishers. The time for confrontation had arrived, and unlike my ex-husband, I had no interest in maintaining performances or protecting carefully constructed image. David saw me approaching and smiled warmly, clearly expecting continued gracious behavior from his mature, well-adjusted ex-wife who understood that their divorce had been a learning experience for both of them. "Victoria," he said as I joined the circle of colleagues currently praising his emotional honesty and professional excellence, "I hope you found the speech meaningful." I meant what I said about learning from our experience together. "Oh, it was incredibly meaningful,"
I replied, my voice carrying enough sweetness to mask the steel underneath, especially the part about your commitment to family values and supporting the people you love through every challenge. Thank you, David said, clearly pleased by what he interpreted as validation from his ex-wife. That means a great deal coming from you. Speaking of family, I continued, my smile never wavering as I prepared to detonate the bomb that would destroy everything David had worked to build. I was wondering if you'd like to tell everyone about Emma, or should I? The color drained from David's face as he realized what I'd just said. Around us, colleagues and friends looked confused by the reference to someone they'd never heard mentioned before. Jessica's expression shifted from contentment to uncertainty as she registered David's sudden pallor and obvious distress. I'm sorry, said Patricia Williams, one of David's colleagues from Morrison Financial Group. Who is Emma? Emma is David's 3-year-old daughter, I said, clearly, my voice carrying easily to everyone within hearing distance. The little girl he's been supporting financially for years, while keeping her existence secret from everyone in his current life, including his pregnant girlfriend. The silence that followed was deafening. David stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing without producing sound as he struggled to formulate a response that could possibly explain what I'd just revealed. Jessica stared at him with growing horror as she realized that the man she was expecting a child with had been lying about fundamental aspects of his life. That's not, David began, then stopped, clearly realizing that denial would be pointless given the specificity of my accusation. Her mother is Sarah Chen, an attorney in Lincoln Park, I continued, providing enough detail to make it clear that this wasn't a malicious rumor but verified information. David visits Emma approximately once per month at various parks and neutral locations, always maintaining complete secrecy about her existence. He's been paying substantial child support through a series of business accounts designed to hide the payments from anyone who might examine his personal finances. Is this true? Jessica asked, her voice barely audible as she turned to face David with an expression of absolute betrayal. David's silence was answer enough. Around us, colleagues who had just finished praising his emotional growth and family values began whispering among themselves as they processed the implications of what they'd just learned. The man who had received an award for ethical business practices had been systematically lying about one of the most fundamental aspects of his personal life. David, Patricia Williams said slowly, you never mentioned having a daughter. It's complicated, David finally managed, his voice hollow with the recognition that his carefully constructed image was collapsing in real time. Sarah and I agreed that it would be better for everyone if we kept our arrangement private. Our arrangement, Jessica repeated, her voice rising with incredulous anger. You have a 3-year-old daughter and you call that an arrangement? The crowd around us was growing as other reception guests noticed the dramatic confrontation developing between the evening's honoree and his pregnant girlfriend. David's professional triumph was being transformed into a public humiliation that would be remembered long after his award was forgotten. Jessica, please, David said, reaching for her arm as she stepped away from him. Let me explain privately. This doesn't change anything between us. This doesn't change anything. Jessica's voice was loud enough now to attract attention from across the ballroom. You have a secret child that you've never mentioned while we've been together for 8 months, while we've been planning our future, while I've been carrying your baby. How does that not change anything? Because Emma isn't part of my regular life, David said desperately, apparently not realizing how much worse he was making everything. I fulfill my financial obligations, but Sarah handles all the actual parenting. It's not like I'm an active father. The admission was devastating in its honesty. David had just publicly acknowledged that he was capable of abandoning his parental responsibilities while maintaining financial support, exactly the kind of compartmentalized selfishness that had destroyed our marriage. The man being celebrated for learning valuable lessons about supporting loved ones had been systematically failing to support his own daughter for years. You're not an active father to your existing child, Jessica said, her voice breaking with emotion, but you want me to believe you're ready to be a father to our baby. David's face was pale with panic as he realized that Jessica was about to leave him in front of everyone who mattered to his career. "Jessica, please don't do this here. We can discuss this privately and work everything out." "Work everything out." Jessica laughed bitterly, placing her hand protectively over her pregnant belly. "Like you worked things out with your ex-wife when she needed support after losing your baby. Like you worked things out with Emma's mother by pretending your daughter doesn't exist." The comparison was devastating because it was accurate. David's pattern of abandoning women and children when their needs became inconvenient was being exposed in front of the professional community that had just celebrated his supposed transformation. "I never abandoned anyone," David said weakly, but even he seemed to realize how unconvincing the protest sounded. "You called your grieving wife broken for mourning your miscarriage," I said, deciding to provide the full context for everyone who was listening. "Then you moved out and started dating someone else while spreading rumors about my mental stability. That's not support, David. That's abandonment. And you've been hiding a child for 3 years," Jessica added, tears streaming down her face as she continued backing away from Dave. "While lecturing me about family values and partnership, while accepting an award for ethical leadership." The crowd of observers had grown to include most of the reception guests, all of whom were witnessing the complete destruction of David's carefully crafted public image. The man who had been presented as a model of ethical business practices and personal growth was being revealed as someone who systematically lied about fundamental aspects of his character. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, raising my voice to address the broader crowd, "I think you're all seeing David's true approach to family values and supporting loved ones through challenges. This is who he really is when the cameras aren't rolling and the awards aren't being presented." David's expression shifted from panic to fury as he realized that his public image was being systematically destroyed. "You vindictive bitch," he hissed, his composed facade finally cracking completely. "You can't stand seeing me succeed, so you're trying to destroy everything I've built." The insult was exactly what I'd hoped for, providing final confirmation of David's true character for anyone who might have still harbored doubt. The man who had just given a speech about learning empathy and emotional maturity was revealing himself to be exactly the same cruel, selfish person who had called me broken for grieving our daughter. "I'm not destroying anything," I replied calmly. "I'm simply sharing information about your existing family obligations with people who might be interested in your actual approach to supporting loved ones through challenges." Jessica removed her engagement ring and threw it at David's feet, the sound of diamond hitting marble floor echoing through the suddenly silent ballroom. "I won't raise my child with someone who lies about fundamental aspects of his life," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "I won't become another woman you abandon when parenthood becomes inconvenient." With that she walked away, leaving David standing alone in the center of a crowd that had gathered to celebrate his success and was now witnessing his complete humiliation. The whispers and shocked conversations that filled the ballroom made it clear that news of David's secret daughter and abandoned pregnant girlfriend would spread throughout Chicago's business community within hours. "I hope it was worth it," David said to me as the crowd began to disperse, colleagues and friends avoiding eye contact as they distanced themselves from the scandal they'd just witnessed. "Completely," I replied, feeling lighter than I had in years. "Emma deserves to have a father who acknowledges her existence. Jessica deserves to know who she's having a child with, and everyone here deserves to know your actual approach to family values before they trust you with their business."